We are live with Ruben George, Truth, Family, Culture, and Health.
Oh, good evening, everybody. And we're live from Vancouver, British Columbia. And so excited to have my bro come on, Eugene Kung. And it's super hot here in Vancouver. You know, I was cold like 10 days ago. It was really cold, like for June. I was like, I almost put on my heater again. And then the heat just came out of nowhere. It's like over 30 degrees. That's like over 85 if you're in the States. And so, you know, it was a big blast. It was super hot. And I'm liking it. I'm digging it. I went for a dip in the ocean yesterday and it was beautiful. Anyway, we got Christine Peterson from Sacred Ecology. She's going to be doing some of the tech background work. And if you have questions, make sure you're on Sacred Ecology on Facebook, and that's where you can post your questions, and that's where she could take them and she could ask Eugene. And of course, we have Peter McCarthy, as I always say, his Tsleil-Waututh Nation's you are the longest, your organization of the Wilderness Committee is our longest ally. Debatable with who Eugene works for, West Coast Environmental Law, but is our lawyer in Tsleil-Waututh too. But I think it's actually you, Peter, so sorry, Eugene. But yeah, excited for the show, and I'm gonna hand it over to Peter because he's gonna give us updates and see what's going on in the environmental world and the TransMountain pipeline and anything else locally that we should all be concerned about.
Yeah, thanks, Ruben. Always a pleasure to be here. And yeah, the name of really most of the updates this week are just, it's all about international solidarity. You know, the TransMountain week of action against insurance companies that have been insuring this pipeline. It, like, as someone that's been fighting this thing for years, I'm sure you had the same. It was just really heartwarming, and it reminds you about how many people are invested in this fight. We saw, you know, organizers from Long Beach in California, where some of the tankers would come into the refineries there. We saw folks from Sierra Leone, from Uganda, from all over the world really showing up in a really big way. So I was really touched by that. I think, and I hope that you are too, to know how many people we have, you know, behind us in the fight for a safe climate and against the Trans Mountain Pipeline. So that was really cool to watch. And then the other big international news was the letter of, I think it was 120 signatories. You know, actors like Mark Ruffalo, they had Greta Thunberg, former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney even signed on to a letter calling on the BC government to end old growth logging. And really, it was pretty cool to see. You know, you had artists like Tegan and Sarah, one of my faves, folks just really chiming in from all over the world. You know, these really big names and big personalities saying that it's just absurd that we're still cutting down 1,000-year-old forests and throwing them onto ships to go be, you know, processed somewhere. It's just terrible. And so that, you know, I don't think that the fight against old growth logging has been this sort of pitched since the 90s, when we had the first war in the woods. So yeah, that's been pretty incredible to watch as well. The other bit of news, it sounds like we're likely headed towards a federal election. There's talk of kind of mid-September that folks, although, you know, I think we've been hearing that since, as in a minority government situation, we've been hearing that since they got elected, that we're always headed towards one. But this seems to be what folks are thinking, and you know, it's an opportunity, I think, to show as British Columbians that we are opposed to this pipeline, and that you know, we don't appreciate a government ramming it through these territories without the consent of the people who've taken care of them for thousands of years. So you know, there's lots of lots of opportunities in an election to make sure that our issues are known, and that, you know, candidates from all parties have to account for their positions on Trans Mountain. Yeah, that's the third piece. The only other thing I want to mention today on the logging issue is I saw some news out of Port Alberni today that the town council has moved to expropriate the land that the sawmill was on. The sawmill's been there for like 100 years, and they shut down in 2017. And so they've basically just been sitting there idle. And if you've been to Port Alberni, you know, the sawmill is like half the waterfront. And, you know, it's pretty interesting to see in a place like Port Alberni that has been a logging town forever, you know, quote unquote, the local government actually moving in and saying, listen, if you're not going to use this mill, we are going to take this from you and, you know, do community economic development with it, and build up our waterfront into the way it should be. The one caveat I want to add to that, I don't know if there was any consultation with, you know, the Hawaiian Nation or any of the other local Indigenous nations for Port Alberni, but I would really encourage the council to work with the Indigenous communities in that area, because they need to, if they're going to expropriate land, it really needs to involve Indigenous peoples, you know, consent and be actively involved in planning for the future of that land. So yeah, that was just something I saw today that was like, wow, you know, the world is changing when a town like Port Alberni is telling a sawmill to you know, to eat dirt. That's basically the news that I had, other than, of course, the scorching heat wave. It's supposed to be 30 something degrees this weekend in Vancouver and Coast Salish territories. And, you know, I think every time that there's these climate impacts, we just need to, it's a punctuation on all these fights and a reminder of why they're so important. We've kind of broken the world's thermostat, and the less fossil fuel that we can put up into the atmosphere, the less carbon pollution we can put up into the atmosphere, the better off we're all going to be, and the less these heat waves. You know, we can all deal with 30s degrees, but once it starts getting over 40 degrees, like we're seeing in Kamloops and stuff, that's some dangerous heat, and we need to we got to stop warming the climates. Anyway, that's the update news from me today. It's been a quiet week, but a real show of international support for some of the local fights that we're having here on the ground.
Yeah, that is that's awesome that so many people rallied to give some support. You know, one quote that I really like that came out of Fairy Creek is, it was a young girl, and she said, come and help stop the logging of the trees and stay for the reconciliation. I thought that was really smart of her to say something like that. And one thing that I'm hearing is from my friends that are over there is that the youth are really setting the tone and pushing really hard and are working with the ideas of reconciliation. And just like how you were talking about the city of Port Renfrew up there and what they should do and how they should be, these young people really get it. And they're really young and they're just going for it. I'm really impressed with them, and gives me a lot of hope, you know, for our future. And you know, one thing I was thinking of is when you're just closing up there is the title of our show, Truth, Family, Health, and Culture. You know, it's apparent each of you that are on the show right now all been to our ceremonies in Tsleil-Waututh, and you know, one important element that is consistently missing in is spirit, is in truth, family, health, and culture, is the cultural side, and not just of us, you know, believing in something, but believing that everything's interconnected. Everything is. I love that study that I looked at, and it talked about how the trees would share their nutrients with other trees. Like if one tree is going to die, the trees around it will send its nutrients over to help it to live. But if a tree is going to die, it will deplete all of its nutrients so the other ones would live. And then I just read another recent study that talked about how we receive some of those positive energy from the trees. And that's why we live where we live. That's why people love Vancouver. You know, in British Columbia, in the Northwest, it's raining, doesn't matter. You go kayaking, go hiking, snowing, doesn't matter. You get out and you go do something, because we get our spirit fed. We for real get our spirit fed. And one thing that I think about those trees, it's really old spirit. And they've been around for hundreds of years and potentially thousands of years. And can you imagine what they witnessed, and the knowledge and wisdom and everything that they carry, and what they could help and how they could help us? And you know, that's what I was thinking of, because that's what this show is about. And working with Eugene is we talked about Coast Salish law, and in the very beginning they said, you know, the elder said, we will support you in stopping this, but you got to explain our law to them. And I was like, our law is the foundation, is our culture and spirituality. How are we going to explain that to people who don't even understand that they carry a spirit within inside of themselves when we're talking about spirit? But anyway, I was thinking those thoughts. I really think so, Peter, for those cool updates. You know, we're moving in the right direction, and I hope there's going to be some stronger resolution that's happening over there. I got some updates myself. The police are getting a little bit more aggressive. You know, they're still doing arrests. The agreement was not to take the old growth forest, but they're not determining which is old, and they're just taking trees down. So there's still people stopping it over there, and that's pretty important. So anyway, I'm going to hand it over to you, Christine.
Okay. Hi, I'm Christine. I'm the founder and director of Sacred Ecology. I've teamed up with Ruben George to host this live stream series. We believe that preserving traditional cultures, indigenous rights, sacred sites, and practicing regenerative organic agriculture is essential for the biodiversity preservation of plant and animal species, and ultimately for sustaining all life on Earth. Ruben George is the Sacred Trust Manager of Tsleil-Waututh First Nation. He's an environmental activist, spiritual leader, Sundance Chief, and the grandson of Chief Dan George. He has spent the last decade educating his neighbors in Coast Salish territory about environmental issues and leading the fight against the TransMountain pipeline in Canada. Eugene Kung, our special guest today, is a staff lawyer with West Coast, working on tar sands, pipelines, and tankers, as well as with RELAW. He is committed to human rights, social justice, and environmental justice, and has been working to stop the Kinder Morgan TransMountain expansion project. Prior to joining West Coast, Eugene was also a staff lawyer with BCPIAC, where he had a social justice law practice in the areas of constitutional, human rights, administrative, anti-poverty, and regulatory law. Welcome, Eugene Kung and Ruben George.
Welcome, Eugene.
Thank you so much.
We have
Smiles are always funny, hey?
Yeah. We have some interesting stories to share. Eugene and I, we've been on the road. We've been to the Kinder Morgan AGM together. We've been on tours with Lummi Nation, going up to the tar sands. We've been to Ottawa. You went to New York. I didn't do that trip, but you went with the nation. So we did a lot of different things together, and we always found time to, you know, chill out. And in Texas, we had to have some ribs. And in Texas, we had to shoot some guns. we went to a driving range, and we had to do that. And anyway, it's good that you're here, Eugene. I think like what I was saying is our law, truth, family, health, and culture is our Coast Salish law, and culture is such a key component of it. Mm-hmm. Just like when we went to court, we explained that, you know, we're going to talk about our law, and if that's the case, we have to make that room a holy room. So some of our members went in there and blessed it and put some of our traditional medicine in there, because if we're going to share our sacred stories, we want the place to be sacred. So, you know, and you were instrumental, as well as our everybody else in treaty lands and resources and other lawyers that we're working with. But it's going to be good today, because I could talk about the cultural and spiritual components about what we're doing, and I want to get into that, but you know, it's good that you could explain it legally. And I think that's really important because the foundation of what we created, I'll get into this later, is what Uncle Lennon, before he passed, we wanted to work on together to start to share and create a governance that's based on our law. But before I get into that, Eugene, I'm going to ask you, what in your heart, this is the first question I ask all the guests, what was in it, in your heart? You became a lawyer, you had an idea to become a lawyer, but you could have went to multiple different streams of being a lawyer, and the price difference about how hard you work and all the great things you do would be significantly different if you went to business lawyer or anything else. But something in you changed your heart where you wanted to make a difference in the world. And what in your life created that moment? What in your life created that moment that you said, hey, you know what? I want to make a difference in this world, and I want to protect what we love. When was it? How old were you, or anything like that? Just I'm gonna hand it over to you, Eugene, and let's see. I'm curious myself because I haven't actually asked you this question.
Well, it's a good question to start with. Not a small question, and probably not one with a short answer either. I'm reflecting back as I kind of thought about it as you were asking the question, and you know, I guess in a way, I've always had a sense and an interest in justice, and have always been drawn to trying to understand in particular, you know, what seemed to be very complicated conflicts. I have a very early memory of my father staying up late to watch the news coverage of the Tiananmen Square massacre, and of course that powerful image of the man standing in front of a row of tanks and stopping that row of tanks for a time, and becoming this kind of iconic image. But I will say, because you kind of suggested in the intro, and that's one thing that's different from my life, and I'll get into this, is that being a lawyer was not really a part of that. I would say that I was on this path before being a lawyer, maybe in spite of having going to law school and ultimately practicing as a lawyer. I certainly had a big political awakening in my undergrad years. I attended the University of British Columbia here in Coast Salish and Musqueam territories in the late 1990s. And within the first month of my time at UBC, there was a massive protest movement in response to the APEC summit, which was happening in Vancouver that year, and which included then Indonesian president and notorious dictator Suharto, who was bringing with him, with the permission of the Canadian government, his kind of security force. And this was one of the issues that was you know, people were concerned about. And so that was one of my first exposures to kind of massive political movements, student movements in particular, to see the power of that, to just get to be out in that space and feel that energy. I remember looking up in the towers of Buchanan, which is part of UBC, and seeing snipers up there and being like, wow, this is real, you know, this is like a real thing. And so of course, for those who may remember, of course, of those APEC protests were ended in a kind of notorious a pepper spray attack on a number of peaceful protesters, and particularly students who were sitting there. And the video of that, this is of course pre-social media. This is like really right at the very beginning of the internet. I think that's when I got my first Hotmail account, but that was kind of a precursor to the kind of viral video, right? This cop spraying just so callously, so much pepper spray on all these protesters. And so that, you know, was certainly something I was interested in. And I pursued some of the kind of theoretical side of it, I guess, through my political science degree, reading and trying to understand political theory. but also getting caught up in the whole anti-globalization movement, which really, it continues today, and there's lots of threads that continue in the work that we're doing now. But really, it's opposing massive corporate power being given land and political space over the interests of local residents who are impacted by these massive corporations, which has then the broader impact both regionally, nationally, and globally of increasing inequality, and whether that's income inequality, wealth inequality, food inequality, that has been increasing in spite of this economic system that's that's really broken. And it was something that I was figuring out at the time, I guess. So I was always interested in this, always interested in kind of progressive politics, but wasn't really sure what to do with that. I had a degree in political science. I wasn't particularly interested or ready to enter like the mainstream workforce. So I traveled around a little bit, and I remember having a thought about, kind of stressing out about like, oh, I'm gonna fall into this pattern of like working a career and doing the thing, and I remember thinking, and this is not a particularly high bar. I remember thinking, if I'm gonna do this and work, we understand that labor and our labor forms a huge part of our own sense of self and identity, right? Because most of us spend a third or more of our lives, adult lives, as workers. And so at that time, all I really wanted to do was to do work that wasn't going to make things worse, right? I was like, I'm not going to work for a mining company. I'm not going to work for any extraction company. I don't work for big tobacco or drugs, that type of stuff. But what specifically, I really didn't have any idea. And so I actually went to law school as a bit of a default, as a bit of a way to buy myself some more time to figure out what I did when I grew up. And so I studied for the LSAT while living in a broken down van in New Zealand at the foot of a ski hill, and I would hitchhike up the hill every day and snowboard, and then I would hitchhike down and do some LSAT practice questions. And then I wrote the LSAT. I had to fly to Australia to write the LSAT, and then a few weeks later got a call from my mom, and she's like, "Oh, you got this letter." She read me the results, and I was like, "Hey, Mom, I can probably get into law school." And so that's what I did. I applied. I was very adamant. If you talk to anyone who I met who knew me at that time, when I entered law school, I was very suspicious of the practice of law. I told anyone who would listen that I was not going to be a lawyer. I was just there to study the law and better understand the mechanisms of change and of social change, and kind of add them to my understanding that I already had. But at the end of the day, it was all grounded in justice. And so I guess the two things that changed while in law school, and because here I am a lawyer now for almost 10 years, I've been a lawyer, which blows my mind. But two things I think primarily changed my thoughts on what to do after law school. One was working for a summer in the downtown east side in Vancouver at First United Church. I worked there as a legal advocate, and I got to experience both working one-on-one with clients, with people that needed assistance, but also being able to, in many cases, or some cases at least, be able to provide like tangible improvements in their lives, whether it was securing housing or a bus pass or ID that had been stolen, or a letter that might help them get a job, or whatever that was. And so that I found a very interesting experience, but also realized that I didn't want to work within a system without having the ability to change the crappy things about that system. And the second thing that changed that was my last semester at Dalhousie, which was where I went to law school in Halifax, where I worked for the legal aid clinic instead of taking courses for my final semester. And similarly, it was this kind of working directly with families in that case, I was doing sentencing hearings for young offenders, criminal offenders, and so really taking into account their lives and the context that led to that. And that work allowed me to get to meet a judge named Connie Sparks, who was one of the first Black judges in Canada, and who wrote a decision that has become infamous in Canadian law, in criminal law, where she actually took what's called judicial notice. So a judge, if there's no evidence otherwise presented at a case, a judge can still accept a particular fact if it's something that they are confident enough in determining as judicial notice. And of course, the history of judges has not been Black women primarily. And so this judge, Connie Sparks, took judicial notice of the fact of racial profiling and how that could have been an element in this case, which involved 2 young Black boys being chased by the police and resisting arrest, but without the context of the relationship between the police and their communities. So it was really interesting to kind of add to these different layers, and I felt very lucky to have continued on that journey, both at BCPIAC, as well as a little bit at the Legal Resources Center in South Africa, where I worked for a bit, and then finally, or most recently, at West Coast Environmental Law. So that was a very long way of saying justice, I guess.
No, that's good. No, it wasn't very long. Actually, sometimes Eugene and I, we present together and they'll give us 30 minutes. And as you see, he'd take about 20 minutes and he'd leave 10 for me.
I'm pretty sure it's the inverse ratio, Ruben, but we'll let people do their own research, as they say. Do your own research, make up your own mind.
I'm joking. I
find some of our talks. No, it's all good.
Sometimes I would do that, but I've been good lately. I've been doing good lately, and because I do think it's important now for people to, and then it's always been important, the legal part of what we're talking about, and the reason why we present good together is because I talk about the cultural and spiritual law, which is simple. And in some ways it's simple and you know, and that's how we've been winning. I believe our law supersedes Canada's law. But you know what's frustrating to me, and you and I talked about this, and let's start a conversation around this. We had Pam from Mi'kmaq on and talking about how they won in Supreme Court, and then they're still stuck in negotiations of the government trying to tell them what is sustainable fishing. Yeah. And the amount of lobster they take, scientists have proven that it's not going to affect anything. As you know, New Charlotte won a case recently, but they're stuck negotiating what is sustainable fishing. Or you look at the Jacolton decision and they're stuck in negotiations too. That's a big frustrating part about what we're doing. Can you talk about that with me a little bit and see what your ideas and insights are of what your experience and what we see together?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think at the very start, we have to recognize that the Canadian legal system is the primary tool of colonization, right? It's one of many tools that were used by the assertion of sovereignty by initially King George something, who signed the Royal Proclamation and claimed Canada as the dominion of the British Empire. And so law at its core doesn't need to, is supposed to be neutral, right? This classic image of the justice holding the scales with a blindfold. It's neutral, but it matters where we think of neutral starting at. And I think we're starting to have those conversations now, and we're starting to really name explicitly some of the founding ideologies that are embedded in Canadian laws. And I'm talking about white supremacy, patriarchy, you know, this very specific notion of what it is to be Canadian. And we're having these conversations now, you know, about how racist John A. Macdonald was and what his vision of an Aryan Canada actually was, which kind of has been swept under the rug as we've over the years, as the kind of narrative around multiculturalism has emerged more so. But those are still embedded within the laws, right? My family first came to Canada in the early 1900s, which was during, as many people know, during a period where the state, Canadian state, or which was still at the time called the Dominion of Canada, was trying to discourage migration from China, which is where my family's from, in southern China. And they implemented a head tax system, which started at $5, went up to $50, and then ultimately up to $500. Just for context, $500 in 1920s was what could buy you a new house in Vancouver. So if we use that as a measure, the equivalent today would be a minimum of 1.5 million, probably closer to 2, depending on the house, I suppose. But those were all part of the Canadian legal system, right?
And put that in context too. People coming from England would pay nothing.
That's right. No, it was the head tax was only applied to Chinese people. And so my grandfather arrived May 31st, 1923. Just over a month later, July 1st, 1923, the head tax era ended and was replaced by what is often called the Exclusion Act. And that law made it illegal for most Chinese people to even come to Canada from 1924 until the late 1940s. So these, I think part of my own journey, learning about Canadian law, practicing within Canadian law, trying to shape and mold it, thinking about things like the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and thinking about them as tools. And that's ultimately how I kind of get out of this. Like, it's easy to be like, well, the legal system is a colonial tool, the main colonial tool. And, we all know the saying about not using the master's tools to dismantle their house. I think that there is certainly a truth to that, and it's important to keep that in mind. But at the same time, there is use in the tools that are there, and the ability to understand when is the right time to use which tool, that has undoubtedly created change, certainly much slower than we'd liked, and certainly with maybe less effect than it promised, but that it is a tool for change. And so when we talk about the assertion of Indigenous rights at Canadian courts, both before 1982, which was when the Constitution Act was adopted, the Charter, which included the Charter and Section 35 and Section 25 in particular. But even that, like those cases, Calder and others, had been argued long before that, because the Indigenous people who were fighting them knew the histories, they knew their own histories, they knew that treaties had not been signed, especially out this way. And in many cases continued to practice their own laws, in spite, again, of Canadian colonial laws trying to eliminate them through things like the potlatch ban, which is essentially a ban on legal procedure. It would be like some invading country coming to Canada and saying, we're going to prohibit your courts from meeting and your legislature from meeting, right? And so in spite of that, Indigenous laws continue to exist in Canada, and not just in theory, but in practice on the ground within communities. And a lot of the work that I've been focusing on and that I'm interested in and excited about is actually not necessarily in working directly and exclusively within Canadian law, but actually trying to embed more Indigenous laws into Canadian decision making, as well as to continue having the courts recognize, as they have in theory, that Indigenous laws continue to exist and apply, but they haven't yet had to kind of deal with the conflict of those. And that's that's the kind of thing you're talking about. On the same time, I want to share about, in spite of all these victories in Canadian courts, the Canadian governments, both federal and provincial, the crown governments, and that should just tell you enough. They're called the crown governments, i.e. the representative of the Queen of England. They continue to approach Indigenous rights rather than a duty and something that they should be following and trying to recognize, but they approach it with what I kind of call a colonial contempt, right? This idea that like they are constantly needing to fight against Indigenous people because that's the very structure that these bodies, whether it's INAC or the Department of Fisheries and Oceans or provincial ministries of forestry and so on, those are all grounded in that foundation. And so it's that approach that kind of starts with denial, sees rights as a burden, treats them with a colonial contempt, and that's why we see these such slow things. So I'm just going to close this door here because my neighbor's dog. So yeah, it's this is lots of smarter people than me have been talking about this for a while. This notion of recognition as a starting point for crown governments is on one hand very revolutionary given the long history of denial and colonial attitudes. On the other hand, it's so basic, it's so nothing, and it's interesting we think about other rights. Think about the right to freedom of expression or the right to assemble and all the kind of rights that are within standard civil liberties that are within the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada. If you go to argue in court that the province or the federal government is infringing on my right to free speech, the court doesn't first ask you, okay, before we talk about whether your rights are being violated, can you just prove that you have those rights, right? The dynamic in courts with Aboriginal rights is such that the first step that the courts have set out is like, oh, you say you have rights to fish or hunt in this area where you've always lived and never left. Well, we want you to prove it, right? And that is very costly, as Ruben knows. Sometimes because of colonization, histories are lost. Sometimes because of the way that Western Enlightenment informed thinking privileges certain types of knowledge, that other types of knowledge get dismissed. And so that's really a lot of what the work that RELAW is involved in, which is revitalizing Indigenous laws for land, air, and water. And it's an attempt by West Coast to contribute to this existing and growing world of Indigenous law, including Indigenous law scholars at the University of Victoria, like John Burrows and Val Napoleon, who are now offering an Indigenous law degree, which is incredible in such a short period of time that this has moved forward. There are now other law schools in Canada who are now also offering Indigenous law studies. And so it's our attempt to kind of contribute to that momentum. We work directly with Indigenous communities, primarily in BC, but also in the Yukon and Alberta, and work with them to look at their stories, look at their songs, look at these various sources of law, art pieces of art, or the land itself as sources of law. And then there's an act of community feedback, an act of community gathering and consultation and discussion, and ultimately results in an expression of those laws that cannot be ignored by governments or by companies who may be operating, who may not, as you said, be able to grasp that the power of a law that's like held within a rattle or a carving, but who cannot ignore a beautifully printed spiral bound, oh my back, there you go, spiral bound document with beautiful tables and stuff and maps. So this work, I think, there's a lot to go there, you know. Just by way of example, some of the things like the Tsleil-Waututh assessment of TransMountain is one example of this, and probably the, you know, one of the most well-known ones, where Tsleil-Waututh applied their own laws to the TransMountain pipeline, but that doesn't mean that they didn't also consider and actually apply that lens to many other sources of information, including world-leading oil spill experts and studies, you know, some anthropologists who started a new form of studying travel times and by canoe, for example, to the long history of spills that Tsleil-Waututh has experienced living directly across from the TransMountain pipeline terminal and the refineries and so on that are in the inlet. So yeah, there's a lot to that. I think at the end of the day, it's this prove it mentality that the government still maintains. It would, you know, for a long time they kept fighting in court, trying to find the floor of what consultation was. And we've been through all these conversations around consultation. I just want to make one last point about that, and then I'll shut up. But, you know, coming back to Canadian law, and a lot of what we hear about in a lot of these cases are about consultation, right? And consultation is super important. But I'll come back to my earlier point. It's so basic. It's the very first step. And if you go back to the history of how consultation came about within Canadian courts and within the Aboriginal law kind of cases, you have it was, you know, the test was largely set out in a case called Haida in 2004. And really what they said was, you know, depending on how what the impact of the activity is and how strong a particular community's connection or strength or claim to the piece of land that's going to be impacted, that's, you know, there's like a spectrum of how much you need to consult. And that's kind of the main thing that's been taken away from that. And what most people forget, and what is the main point of Haida, is that consultation was meant to be a temporary state of affairs, while the underlying questions around title, around governance, around control, around the applications of Indigenous laws, for example, well, those were resolved. That's what the court said. If you go back and read that case, they're like, yeah, this is not meant to be like the end all, but instead it's been treated as this kind of never ending norm that's all they have to do. All we have to do is consult and do our own thing. And as we've seen recently in the Coldwater decision, it has limits, right? And the government has gotten better at basically turning what was once a substantive right, so like you need to have some substance to it, to try to water it down to become a procedural right. So as long as you just go through certain steps, that you're okay. And unfortunately, in many ways, that is representative of Canadian law. When we think again about the scale of justice and the blindfolded woman, it's the way that it gets applied in Canadian law is really about procedural fairness and procedure more than the substantive justice, which is what I want and what we all want. I hope who are on this call. That's a lot harder, and maybe it's something that is not, well, certainly not something that can only happen in the courts. It has to happen within the hearts and minds of people. And I do think that the courts have had some role in changing the way that people think and understand Indigenous rights, by just making strong declarations that are based in law and based in truth that you know, you can't ignore.
Wow, yeah, no kidding. You know what drives me nuts is the whole process you explained, but having the guests on the show that, you know, last week Tamara Starblanket, and you know, her amazing book that she wrote on residential school, but the inquiry was ridiculous. It was you know, it wasn't set up well, because they had to prove what kind of abuse they went through. You know, it was crazy. And they had, and then the murder, missing woman inquiry, you know, mutual friend of ours, a lawyer, I phoned her because they asked me to MC for British Columbia, and she said, no, they have no credibility, and they're asking you because they want credibility. 17 executives quit. They should be doing the inquiry on the police, on the judges, on the coroners, and they didn't do that. They didn't do that. And then what I was mentioning with the fishing or the logging, and you brought that up, there's a standard that Canada sets, and it's wrong. We win, and it doesn't even have to be a fight when they know we're going to win, but it still is. And it drives me nuts because it's all aspects. Even in business now, I see that. I see that in one of our developments. I share this often in the show that we put in an application, I think it was between 100 150 housing units, and they denied us. The city of North Vancouver, not even 5 miles down the street, they approved one that doubled what we asked for. And it happens. It's always constantly happening. If it's within our rights, it shouldn't be a fight. It shouldn't be a fight. When we say, you know, our Canadian Constitution, to have the freedom to hunt and fish. How could we have the freedom to hunt and fish when you're destroying it? And that's how we stop it. And that's why so many allies come to First Nations and ask them for support. But thank you for that explanation. Thank you. And by the way, I have to do a shout out to your backdrop. That's what it feels like. We're the rebels against the evil empire, Star Wars. And but I'm with Eugene Kung, a good brother, a good friend, a lawyer for West Coast Environmental Law. Is one of our lawyers for Tsleil-Waututh Nation. You know, and you know, I'm friends with your family. You know, I met your mom and your brothers, and you know, of course, Allie's awesome, and you know, you come to ceremony, and my family knows you, my mom knows you, everybody knows you, and you're part of our community, and that's why we call each other brother. And this is Eugene Kung, and we're really happy to have you here. I want to jump into something. I think because I'm asked this often, and it would be and you explain it to me often, and of course we went through the process together, but we won in court the first time. We lost the second time, and we're denied Supreme Court. So we have about 12 minutes, Eugene, to explain those three things. I know it's hard and difficult, and we could make this show ongoing series with everything that we've done and everything that we traveled, all the things that we did, and all the times we went to court. We're running out of time already, but we didn't even touch the assessment. We didn't even touch our economic analysis, the spill analysis, the multiple economic analysis, what turned into our court case. But that's a segue into that question. We won, we lost, denied Supreme Court. So
what happened there? Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, on a high level, I think it really highlights the limits of the consultation framework, right? Which I kind of touched on earlier. In the first round, so this case was called Tsleil-Waututh versus Canada. But at the time, the longest ever hearing at the Federal Court of Appeal. The previous record holder was the Gitga'ala versus Canada, which was the Enbridge Northern Gateway case, which of course quashed that as well due to inadequate consultation. It was always going to be the case, or a risk, that when the problem with winning a consultation case is that you win more consultation, and that's exactly what happened. You will recall, after that really glorious day, August 30th, 2018, all of us gathered in Crab Park. And not long afterwards, we heard the federal government made the decision, as was their right, to not appeal the case, but to go back and do better, and try and do better. And that kick-started a whole another consultation process. Before I get to that, I do want to say that during the arguments at the Tsleil-Waututh case, what the government of Canada said was, hey, we studied Gitga'ala, we studied the case before where we failed, and we implemented all the things that you said we did wrong, and so therefore we've done it better now, we fixed those things, so don't worry. This time around, of course, they said the same thing. They purported to look at what the judgment said, and they ordered the National Energy Board to do a reconsideration after having excluded marine shipping from a project whose main purpose is to export via marine shipping. And then they went back and redid some of the consultation. And without getting into too much detail, I will say that round 2 was not better than round 1. If anything, it was worse, more frustrating. At least the same patterns emerged. What was different in round 2 was that the proponent, the owner of the project, was now also the government of Canada, which in my view, put them in an impossible situation of conflict of interest. And how could they make this decision objectively when they are also the owners? When we made that argument to the Federal Court of Appeal at the initial stage, it was scoped out of the decision. They said, no, this is not part, we're not going to accept this as part of the decision. I still disagree with that, and I'm quite baffled by that because it seems so obvious. But this is how our court system works, unfortunately, is that when you appeal certain decisions, you have to get permission or leave. And so the first setback was in the second appeal, which became the Coldwater case, was that the Federal Court of Appeal, and they issued their leave decision, cut the illegal issues in half, right? They said, the only thing we want to talk about is consultation between the Tsleil-Waututh decision and the second approval. That's all we care about. That's all that we're reevaluating. We're going to throw out any arguments that have to do with bias, conflict of interest. We don't want to hear about whether they actually addressed the southern resident killer whale issue. It was really a challenging and one of the weirdest leave decisions ever, because usually, for those who aren't lawyers, leave decision is usually a one-page yes, no, or maybe a little bit more if they wanted to split some issues like this. This was like a lengthy written decision setting out why they were doing these things. And so that alone was a bit strange, but it was the hand we were dealt, and still felt very much that, the errors in consultation were such that they were, they made the same mistakes. And things like, when we discovered, for example, that Canada had altered some of the documents that they provided to Tsleil-Waututh to edit out the notes from their own scientists, which said that they agreed with our studies, right? Like these types of things that the court was able to kind of look past. And one of the reasons they were able to look past that was the second reason I think that we lost that case.
Can I make a comment on that, Eugene, really quick?
Yeah.
When did we not submit that evidence to the 3 judges, and they said we're not going to look at that today?
Oh, they looked at it. They considered it, but they just didn't. When they weighed it compared to everything else, it didn't tip the balance, I guess is how you could put it. So the other main thing that was, and I'll be quick about this because it's really in the weeds, legal stuff, but it's a case called Dunsmuir, or sorry, that was the old case. A new case came out called Vavilov, which was, if you're interested, about the children of Russian spies who were born in Canada and whether those Canadian-born children deserved procedural rights in terms of their own citizenship. Anyway, not really, doesn't seem like it should be about pipelines or applicable to pipelines, but the Supreme Court took that and a couple of other cases, administrative law cases that were about Super Bowl advertising, of all things. And the principles that came out of that that applied to the Coldwater case really had to do with what I talked about earlier, which was making consultation cases even more about procedure than about substance. And basically what the court adopted and applied from Vavilov to the case in Coldwater in their decision was, we used to go and look at everything that the Crown did in their consultation and look at the notes and the records and all these things. And from that, we could kind of make a decision on whether it was adequate or meaningful consultation or not. Well, we think that that's kind of a substitute for correctness, for like what our own decision would be, when that's not the standard that the courts are supposed to apply to administrative decision. They're supposed to apply a lower standard, in the sense that courts are supposed to give deference or the benefit of the doubt to administrative tribunals because they have a specific expertise, right? Courts are kind of generalists, but the CRTC knows a lot about radio, television, communications. The NEB knows a lot about energy and energy economics, and a judge might not. So that's the theory behind it. in practice, of course, there's a lot of challenges to that, especially as the NEB, now CER, has to grapple with climate change and Indigenous rights, which they're not experts in, but I digress. What the court applied from Vavilov was basically like, we aren't going to hold the government to that high of a scrutiny. The fact that they provided reasons that set out why they made the decision they made, and that with that decision was within a realm of reasonable outcomes, that's the only test we're going to use. And so that was the lower bar, and cutting out some of the legal issues was why I believe that that case was lost. There's also the dynamic of like, when you win a consultation case, then you get more consultation. Like each time it's going to be diminishingly less that you can, as they kind of slow, assuming that the government does try to learn from these things. And so it was always going to be a challenge. And again, I think it really points out the limits of consultation cases. And, you, Ruben, and I, we've talked a lot, and Ruben likes, to point out that First Nations have been winning at about a 90% rate on resource cases in Canadian courts. And there's a lawyer named Bill Gallagher who's been studying this for decades. Resource rate. Yeah, that number that's right. It's like 200 and something plus cases at about a 90% rate. But the reason isn't as much as I would like to say, because the lawyers working for First Nations are so much smarter than the lawyers working for the government, or even that justice is on our side, which it is or should be. No, unfortunately, the reason for that winning streak is because, as I mentioned earlier, governments have approached consultation with such a colonial contempt, where they're trying to do the least possible, that even the courts are like, you are really screwing up here. And so that is why the 90% success rate exists, because governments are not even, they're aiming for the floor and they're missing the floor.
Can I explain a little bit of that?
Mm-hmm.
It drives me nuts, and I bring this up often too, is remember Stephen Kelly put in 20% of Kinder Morgan's application on behalf of Kinder Morgan, then was hired to the National Energy Board. And then he was hired by the National Energy Board. That's right. And then as well as 3 others.
He was actually appointed by Stephen Harper as one of Stephen Harper's last acts.
I know, it's
as
crazy.
Prime Minister. Yeah.
It's so crazy. And then the quote that we shared, that you gave, cannot unscramble an egg. And they tried to do that by creating the ministerial committee. Then they said, hey, we hired a First Nation, a former employee of Kinder Morgan, to fix the mess the NEB created. And that's when they didn't own the pipeline. And so when we're doing consultation and we're going to explain our 1,200-page assessment, get their best scientists and best minds in a room and look at it for a week, and then you still won't come up with and analyze the work we did in a 1,200-page assessment, let alone, what was it, Eugene? 40 minutes? That's how long we got?
Something like that, yeah.
It's so crazy. So that's their consultation. And so, sorry, I just wanted to say that, Eugene.
No, it's true. All those things are true. And it's so incredibly frustrating. I'm sure people can relate to being in a conversation with someone who has no interest in either hearing what you have to say or changing their minds in any way, and are just kind of going through the motions. And unfortunately, that's a lot of what consultation looks like.
Yeah, one of our elders, he said, when you're going to court, remember, they're just the Canadian, the court is just a branch of Canada, and who owns the pipeline. And they did fix it that way. And putting the parameters of what we had to work with before we even went into court was ridiculous. It's so ridiculous, but this is the standard that we're talking about of what Canada has done and what is doing and what continues to do is whether it's the trees, or gas, oil, or coal, or murder, missing women, or residential school survivors. It's all the same. It's all the same. It's just ridiculous and drives me crazy. And we're finding more and more about this as we go along and with our show. And just thinking there, Peter, maybe we might want to do a conference so we could have a couple-day event and bring these people back where we could round all this up and have some dialogue about these things, because Eugene, Pam would love to talk with you, and some of the other guests that we had on would love to talk to you. But do you want to finish up your thought there, Eugene, before we jump to some more questions?
No, I'm good. Let's get to some questions. I'm really curious to see here what folks want to hear about.
I got the green light to continue to move forward, but Peter's and Christine said let's just continue doing it. But I'm going to let Peter jump in and ask a question. We got about 29 minutes here, so Peter, anything on your mind here, buddy?
Yeah, reminder to folks, if you have questions for Eugene and our guest, just go to the Sacred Ecology Facebook page, and on the live stream, comment on that video. We'll only be able to see him if you comment on the Sacred Ecology Facebook page on that live stream. Eugene, yeah, I was just wondering, you're kind of the like go-to law person anytime we have a law question about anything. So I apologize if this is outside of your area of expertise, but I'm curious about Bill C-15 and the implementation of UN DRIP in Canada. We've had some folks on the show that you know are opposed to it. I know there's lots of mixed feelings about there, but I'm curious what you think that bill means for law in Canada, and if specifically if it has any implications for the Trans Mountain Pipeline.
Well, I'll start with the first one. The second part, because it's easier. Unfortunately, no. Certainly at this point, perhaps in the future. Yeah, I'm familiar with the debate around C-15 and a similar debates that originated here with the Declaration Act in BC. And I'm of the view that, and those criticisms are legitimate. I do want to say, like, it's, I'm thinking specifically about this, this idea that the lack of recognition of Indigenous rights in Canada is not due to the lack of tools, of legal tools within Canadian law to uphold Indigenous rights. Okay, those tools have always been there, and the way in which the Crown agencies have interpreted them or applied them is the problem. So I totally agree that like people like that, this is not going to change everything overnight. And I also recognize that, for many people, the domestication of the United Nations Declaration is in and of itself a weakening of it, that it's now subject to federal, a national state law, right? However, I do support, I'm glad that it passed, and I will be following it closely, just like I have been with the Declaration Act in BC, because what it really is a framework to potentially do more. The act in and of itself doesn't really change anything, but what it provides is more tools. Again, there have been tools that have existed. Tools have existed for a while, but more tools and more of a clear framework to move forward in recognizing Indigenous rights, Indigenous laws, Indigenous decision making, and ultimately the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which is ultimately about self-determination, right? And so I'm glad that it's passed. Let me just a quick story of like, how it's already, I believe, having an impact. And it's maybe outside of the legal world and outside of our worlds in the nonprofit sector, but in the beginning of 2020, oh, time is so weird these days, but anyway, I think it was the beginning of last year, 2 years ago. No, it can't have been. It must have been just this last one. Sorry. Beginning of 2021, I got an email from a random cold call email that was forwarded from one of my colleagues from a University of Toronto Business School project who were looking to update their corporate governance report, which they had done 10 years previously and had apparently had huge impacts on companies that report on the Toronto Stock Exchange. Kind of the beginning of what we kind of now think of the ESG movement, environmental, social governance, is kind of like corporate responsibility, which I have lots to say about that as well. And there's lots of reasons to be cynical about that. But certainly this kind of notion of improving the way that that the business and private sector operates. And so they were super interested in understanding C15 and understanding what the standard of consent might mean and understanding all these things. And these private actors, these private companies are not going to go out and seek these things out on their own because it's the right thing to do, right? They're only going to do this because they feel like there's a structural component that compels them to do it. And so if that structural component is a federal piece of legislation that is all of a sudden starting companies to take Indigenous rights seriously, to understand that the lack of consent by all impacted Indigenous peoples or rights holders for any particular project, that if you don't have that, it's what they would talk about in the business world as material risk. Once they start understanding those things and piecing them together rather than ignoring and coming from this place of denial, as I've talked about earlier, once it starts from a place of recognition, then it's not that hard to see how, for example, a financial institution might give a better lending rate to a company that can demonstrate that they have consent. You know, if you think about two mines, and I know this is a hard image, but it's like two mines in Indigenous territories. One of them has the full consent and maybe even participation and ownership of that nation. The other one doesn't. One of them is more valuable than the other, right? From a financial perspective, from a lender's perspective, from a risk perspective, which is ultimately what this is all about. And so I do believe that C15 has moved the conversation forward, especially in mainstream spaces, to make the United Nations Declaration seem less scary, to make the concept of free, prior, informed consent something that people don't want to just ignore or dismiss, and to start to uphold Indigenous rights. And ultimately, I'll just end on this, like I actually think where we need to be, because the C15 and the Declaration Act also talks about updating current legislation, right, with this lens of the Declaration. And we've seen baby steps in that already. In BC, the new Environmental Assessment Act, again, still lots to be desired, but it actually is much more open to cooperation with and joint decision making with Indigenous nations. You know, Tsleil-Waututh Nation tried during the National Energy Board's TransMountain hearing, wrote to the National Energy Board saying, hey, we're a jurisdiction, we want to cooperate with you under the section of your act that says you will cooperate with other jurisdictions. They had no idea what to do with that. They were like, no, what we mean is like municipalities and provinces. We're like, well, this is a jurisdiction that has constitutional authority, right? And so making it clearer to give the authority for Crown bodies to make co-decision, you know, not to consult, but to make joint decisions, to create these types of bodies. Again, it's not new. These tools already existed. Tsleil-Waututh has joint management of Sinukweem, the provincial park, of Weyawichin, the municipal park, right? Like these structures are not necessarily new. But my hope is that the more that Indigenous laws and the worldviews that inform them get embedded into our decision making, that, you know, the current Canadian laws and the worldviews that inform them, that we talked about already, white supremacy, this kind of dominion over land, this reduction of the natural world to commodities, and that the value of a forest is only the number of board feet that you can extract from it, towards one that understands the interconnectedness and the dependence that we have, which does not mean that we stop entirely using the resources that are around us, but that you do those in a more thoughtful way that has a longer tail in terms of the impacts and the regenerative nature of many of these, of some of these resources anyway.
Yes, thank you, Eugene. Holy smokes, so much more to talk about. So any other questions from you, Peter?
I mean, my last question, Eugene kind of answered in the last bit of it. Let's see if there's any from Facebook.
Christine?
Yeah, I just got a question on Facebook, which says, perhaps there is a test case for UNDRIP if and when TransMountain changes ownership?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So if I could pull that apart a little, so the decision to sell might be considered a decision that requires consultation, or even potentially consent. That's a tricky one. I have to think about that, but I love the creativity and the thinking forward, because yes, I think that's going to be a huge challenge for this current government to sell this project, which they've said they want to do on a commercial basis. I'm not going to get into the details, but from a commercial basis, this project is a stinker, I guess is what I'll say. And there's a reason Kinder Morgan ran away from the project when they did. So I think it's going to be really hard for the federal government to sell it on commercial basis and to make back their money. The only way I see it happening is if they hugely subsidize whoever's buying it, unfortunately. I will think more about this question about a test case about the sale and whether that's an appealable decision, but it's not, and it would start in a lower court, but good thinking about that stuff.
Okay, I have a general question myself as well, which is, what is the power of merging the indigenous rights law with environmental law? And what would your advice be to others around the world in doing so?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I think in many ways, there are natural convergences, and that's certainly starting to play out more. I also want to recognize that environmental organizations have also engaged in kind of colonial dynamics. And that in particular, when the environmental movement was growing in the 60s and 70s a lot and trying to put environmental issues on the political map, we reproduced many of the same power dynamics that you need that existed within the political space. So patriarchy, white supremacy, I'm just going to keep saying those things over and over, but that is very much also part of the environmental movement. And I think for me, the shift is away from conservation towards justice, towards decision making. I think the shift, the kind of the timelines on which we imagine things, in the business world, it's quarterly, right? It's like every 3 months. Those are the timelines they're working on to meet these targets. Within electoral politics, it's often the election cycle, 3 to 5 years. And so that gives you another kind of timeline to work, but ultimately not that long to accomplish big things. You contrast that to this notion of 7 generations to inform your decisions, and you're going to make completely just different decisions if that's what you're looking at. And we're in the moment now with the climate crisis, where we're about to pay for or come to head with some of these short-term decisions made years and years ago, and the continual short-term decisions that have been made to not actually address this problem in a meaningful way, so that we're now at a point where actually we need very radical change. So I think it's a combination of embedding the worldviews that I talked about, giving up decision making and power, not just land back, but cash back and power back, right? Let's move towards that. And I think there's a lot of space that environmental organizations can play to uphold and work with Indigenous communities. It's an ongoing learning process, especially for those who are not primarily Indigenous. But it's also something that we're all in this together, and we are all invested in surviving the climate crisis and in finding solutions to it. And I think that's going to be probably the biggest gift is when people en masse realize that this economic system that requires unlimited growth in order to maintain stability on a planet with finite resources, when they realize that that's probably not going to be the way to go forever, that we look to other alternatives and other examples that are working, and we've seen many of those already, and certainly in many cases Indigenous peoples are leading in spite of surviving genocide and the many traumas that have that are connected with that. So yeah, that's kind of my thought on that.
Awesome. Great response. Just a little follow-up question is the concept of decolonization. When people say decolonize your mind,
Yeah.
can you explain to people what that means?
Oh, there's so much to that, and thank you for asking that question, because it's really important. And because often non-Indigenous people think about colonization as something that happened to Indigenous people, and they don't recognize that we are also colonized in our instruction. So think back to what you learned in school. What were you taught about the history of Canada? What were you taught about Indigenous people in Canada? What were you taught about ways of knowing? You know, I was having this interesting conversation with my father the other day on Father's Day, and he grew up in Hong Kong, and then he moved here for university, and he worked as an engineer, and he's retired now, and he's starting to like get into philosophy and reading all these things, and it's really interesting having these conversations. We often fight, so that's not as fun, but that's just our dynamic. But he was talking about like his own experience and recognizing himself as a colonized person growing up in British occupied Hong Kong, right? He's like, I don't speak English particularly well, I don't speak Chinese particularly well, and this is the product of this colonial thing. So I think there's lots of ways to question our own understanding of the world, and that's hard. Sometimes it's hard to do. I think the biggest thing is to be open to the idea that like something that even you feel in your heart is so true, or you believed forever has been so true, may not be. And being open to that, and that can be challenging for sure, because it can completely fundamentally change how you see the world and how you live within the world. And at the end of the day, to borrow from Thomas King, the truth about stories is that it's all we are. Like the stories we tell about who we are is who we are. And so there's a lot of endless things that can come up with there. But I think starting by obviously reading and learning from Indigenous thinkers and speakers without being extractive, right? Recognizing power dynamics where they show up, whether it's, as a lawyer and a client, or as someone who's trying to help. And, in some regards, it's easier for us as a legal NGO to work with Indigenous communities because the power is clear. They are the clients and they are our bosses, and we follow their instructions. That's a different dynamic than like an NGO being like, hey, we want to partner with you on a campaign, but we have these certain ideas and goals, right? And so it can be easier in many ways because of that particular dynamic of the lawyer-client relationship. One last thing that I've been thinking about, and this is not a fully formed thought, so but it is an interesting, it's in this line of decolonizing thought, and it's kind of like the promise of the Enlightenment, right? And the whole idea of these reasonable beings that are living in this society and here to maximize our own to maximize our utility and so on and so forth, and it gave rise to the scientific revolution and all these different things that have brought us in obviously a lot of benefits, but also a lot of challenges, right? Like we have the scientific ability to blow up the world many times over now, and we have for 50 years. And so this, I touched on this a little bit earlier, but it's kind of like the role of reason and logic within knowing, and in our pursuit of reason and logic and our elevation of that, we have privileged this way of knowing, which is super valuable and useful, as I've said, but above all other ways of knowing. And we've incorporated it into our political and economic systems in a way that, I'm going to break it down, is like just doesn't make sense. So like, first of all, by recognizing that humans are beings capable of reason, and that's what makes us arguably the dominant, well, undoubtedly dominant species, but like, that's what sets us apart from other beings in the natural world, is that we have the ability to reason and to think, plan ahead, and to remember from the past, and to hopefully improve, right? To make building plans, and to plan cities, and to move entire rivers trajectories so that we can power our phones or whatever. And so we have this notion, right, of like humans are beings capable of reason. And that's true. Somehow along the way, the story became that humans are reasonable beings all the time, which I think if you think about it, you know that that's not true. If you've ever had kids or spent time around kids, you definitely know that's not true. Myself as well, I'm definitely prone to being unreasonable. And this is coming from like someone who works with logic and reason as my profession. But at the end of the day, we're not reasonable by default. We are emotional by default, and we have the ability to reason. But we took this kind of notion, this story that came out of the Enlightenment, and then we developed the economic systems. And the first assumption of classic economics is that humans are rational actors who will maximize their utility, right? And we built this entire economic system, which I touched on earlier, that's now dependent on growth in order to maintain stability. That's based on this assumption that's just not true. And, that's kind of where my thought on this ends. Again, it's not like a huge revelation other than to like really pick apart and question how much we privilege one way of being over others. I remember talking about at the National Energy Board, debating with our team at Tsleil-Waututh whether to talk about sacred tunnels at the National Energy Board, right? Something that doesn't particularly have a scientific explanation or confirmation. And at the end we did, because it was felt it was important to share that with the National Energy Board. But of course, the risk being, or I think at the time it was a CER, but at the risk being, of course, that like that type of knowledge gets seen as less valuable than an oil spill study, or some like even something like the IEA's energy forecast. All of those things that are done under economics and finance are also projections about the future, which are not grounded in necessarily in reality. So anyway, that was a lot of maybe babbling, but ultimately, if we're talking about decolonization, I think first look within, sit with the discomfort that comes from it. And this happens, all the time for me, where I'm like, oh wow, I really had been thinking about this the wrong way, or I never questioned it. And I really credit and thank Ruben for pushing me on a lot of these things, for opening my eyes on a lot of these things over the last number of years that we've got to work together and be good friends.
Thank you. Well, we have Eugene Kung, lawyer for West Coast Environmental Law, lawyer for Tsleil-Waututh Nation. Eugene has been working with us for 8 years now. Is it 8 years? 8 years. And it's awesome to have you on the show. We're going in the direction of figuring out what we're going to do as Tsleil-Waututh Nation legally. So we I don't talk about it until we figure things out. And but what I do wonder, and I know you do other things, like Peter mentioned about the insurance, and you and I worked on a lot of different things as well. But you got about a couple more minutes to share what you're working on now, and let's give us an update on that.
Yeah, sure.
Besides the Tsleil-Waututh Nation legal things.
So we've talked about the insurance. So I think obviously continue to work with the RELAW team and think about and provide support and training to Indigenous communities to express and enforce their own laws. And that's a beautiful and ongoing process that I get to work with an amazing team with at West Coast Environmental Law. I'm also been delving a little bit deeper into the financial world. This is ironic. You mentioned at the top that I could have gone and been a business lawyer and maybe made more money and whatever. And my response was like, I never wanted to be a business lawyer. I never wanted to do any of that. Here I am making less money, but still being a business lawyer essentially, because I'm dealing with corporations and dealing with financial institutions. So, but at least I'm on the right side, and I'm not starving. So, but I've been delving into financial institutions, and particularly insurance sector, who are already moving capital in a meaningful way away from fossil fuel sector, to accelerate that and to also have them understand better that the violation of Indigenous rights is a material risk that must be taken seriously in their decisions. And that's increasing, and I think that's exciting. So that's kind of the main stuff I've been working on at West Coast. I do have I don't know if you have any closing things you want to say, but I could end with a story that I think kind of summarizes my relationship with Ruben and our working together. Can I do that?
Sure, go ahead.
So Ruben mentioned this at the very top about how when we were in Houston, Texas, following, I think the second time we went to the Kinder Morgan annual meeting, we had a few hours to kill before our flight home. We'd already eaten barbecue, so we were eating Mexican food. And Ruben had this, he was like, I was like, what should we do? We're in Texas, we have a few hours, what should we do? I'm like, well, what's something that's like very Texas that we can't really do anywhere else? And he was like, we could shoot some guns. And I was like,
there's a driving range on every block in Houston, Texas, I swear to God.
I was like, okay, that's interesting. I've never shot a gun. I'm like an urban pacifist over here. My parents didn't let me have Nintendo because it came with a gun. That's what they told us anyway. And so I was like, yeah, sure, let's check it out. So we borrowed we looked on Google Maps. We found that from where we were, there was probably 15 or 20 gun ranges within a mile. We picked one, we drove there, and we get there and we just kind of walk up. We're like, hey, how's it going, y'all? What do you? We're like, hey, we just want to shoot some guns. And we're like, oh, sure, yeah. Do you have your own guns? And we're like, nope. We're like, oh, no problem. Here's a case. They have this huge case, and like $15 gives you access to all of these guns. You can trade them out, do whatever. Another $15 gives you access to the room, the shooting range, and then you just pay for your ammo. Sound good? We're like, sure, sounds good. And so we were looking at the guns, we were trying to pick out their ammo, and we were signing up and so on. And then the guy's like, okay, before I let you in, I just have to do a real quick safety test. And so Ruben's holding a Glock, and he's like, okay, I just need you to show me that you know how to like empty the magazine and check the chamber. And then Ruben was like,
I tried to.
He was trying to figure it out, and the guy, and so he was like, sorry guys, I just like, you're not quite. I don't think I can send you in there without really knowing.
We had to take lessons.
And Ruben was like, oh no, crap, we really wanted to do this. Oh no. And I was like, well, hold on. Is there like a course we can take or something? Gun safety, like I personally would prefer to learn about guns from an expert rather than trial and error. Turns out it fit with our schedule. And so we took a course with a very friendly guy with about 8 guns on him on every pocket, and he showed us. We did the safety course. We learned how to, all the things about how to properly handle a gun. And then we did our shooting range, and it was so great. And it was so fun in the end. And at the end of the day, we were leaving, and Ruben's like, oh, thanks, that was so fun. And I was like, that wasn't me, that was your idea. And so I've told this story before because it's this microcosm of my working relationship with Ruben and why I love him so much, is that like he'll come up with an idea that is maybe not immediately obviously awesome to me, but I will be open to it because why not? Let's see. And somewhere along the way, we will probably come up with some challenges, some hurdles, some things we have to overcome, and we do them together. We figure things out together, and then we get to do this awesome idea that Ruben all along knew was going to be awesome, but that I often don't realize because I'm stuck in the process until afterwards. And so that was the story of us in Houston, Texas, shooting guns. I know it's our time here. Ruben, I just want to thank you for having me on, and for Christina and Peter as well for doing this every week. And I really look forward to seeing you all again, and all the best with the rest of this podcast, and we'll see you all on the streets.
Well, the first time we spoke in the Kinder Morgan AGM, remember you created that meme. Their stock fell by 60%. Their dividends were cut by 74%, 3 months of the day that we spoke there. So that was fun. And it's a $350 billion company. And we went to Kinder Morgan's house in their building and their meeting and said, what's up? But you know, Eugene, you feed me as well as the other people on our team. But and happy we get to present together most of the time. But when we don't, you're always with me and filling my head. There's you know, I may be the face of what we're doing, but there's amazing people like you, Aaron, Chloe, and the past ones, Carlene and Gabe and Bones and Ernie George and so much more that have been really Ben West, Irwin. So there's been a lot of key people, but you managed to stay almost this whole time, so that's good. We still got a little bit more time to end this damn pipeline. So
Yep.
Thank you, Eugene. Thank you, Christine, and thank you, Peter. And love you guys, and happy you came on, Eugene.
Thanks for having me.